Hello, I'm Tiffany Thomas with the Oracle Applications User Group. Welcome everyone to our last session of OAUG's inaugural Risk Week. Today's e-learning session is called GDPR, More Than Just Report It and Forget It. OAUG will host over 500 sessions on topics pertinent to the applications of today and tomorrow, such as this one at Collaborate on April 22nd through 26th at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, Nevada. Before we get started, I would like to go over a couple housekeeping items. You will be on mute throughout the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the question box in your control panel at any time. Once the presentation has concluded, I'll read the questions back so the presenters can respond. We're recording this session, and it will be available on the OAUG website later today. I would like to introduce to you your presenters for today, Aidan Parisian and Keith Goldsmith.
Thanks, Tiffany. And can you guys see my slide deck here?
Yes.
Alrighty, welcome today. Thanks for those who are on the West Coast at lunchtime or on the East Coast, it's 3 o'clock. Although we earlier discussed the weather, so depending on where you are in the country, this time you have has a different comparative advantage. So today we're here to talk about GDPR, more than just report it and forget. Obviously the deadline's coming up here pretty soon, and I think most organizations have been thinking about this for some time, but I think that said, there's always good reason to have this be a topic and to discuss it again. So a high-level agenda for today. We'll talk about an overview. What is GDPR? What constitutes personal data? Myths and conceptions, key definitions, EU data subject rights, and then Keith will talk about planning for GDPR, GDPR audit unknowns. We'll have a summary, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Keith and I are knowledgeable about GDPR. That said, we have people who are more knowledgeable than us within our organization. So depending on your depth and technicality of request, we may have to get back to you, but we'll try to answer everything we can today. So as a quick introduction, my name is Aidan Parisian. I'm a Director of Risk and Compliance Solutions for Fastpath. I live in San Jose, California. That's my weather comment. Over a decade of experience as an auditor and consultant, understanding compliance frameworks and standards, applying those to businesses. I was part of some of the front run of PII in the US when all that started to come up and become significant for technology companies in the Bay Area. And so this is an area that I'm very familiar with, both in dealing with the technicality and the ambiguity of the regulation. And then I've got a focus on integration of business process and systematic control. So really what that means is my area of expertise is in understanding where and how to pull levers within the organization to make sure that you're compliant. Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. So I've spent most of my career auditing here in the Northeast of the United States. I've worked in external audit for many years and kind of thought I was a lifer before I decided to try my hand in industry, where I helped lead up the internal audit function of a large utility company through and take them through IPO and then through a new ERP implementation. So as you can probably imagine, reading into that experience, I designed and implemented a new list of internal controls almost every year, which I do not recommend. It'll make you pull your hair out for sure. From there, I decided to spend some more time in the ERP space and went to work for NetSuite and eventually for Oracle for a number of years, helping to guide companies through IPO and all different forms of compliance in their financial and other systems. Happy to be here to discuss the GDPR regulation and what it means to companies in the EU and especially here in the United States. Back to you, Aidan.
Thanks, Keith. So here's our disclaimer. Today's webinar is not designed to present specific advice or guidance to ensure GDPR compliance for you personally or your company. It is for informational purposes only. It does not replace the need to seek qualified professional and legal advice concerning GDPR and how it relates to you and your company. I do take issue with the fact that this insinuates that Keith and I are not qualified professionals. I think maybe there's some people that would say that, but he and I would disagree. The main purpose of this disclaimer, obviously, is to say that you shouldn't trade or operate based on the advice you get today, right? We're here just to talk about this as a high level topic, and we're not contracted to be in a situation where we're giving you legal or professional advice like we would if we worked at a large firm or organization that's focused in the space. So let's start with an overview of GDPR. I think many have heard of GDPR. Obviously, you're probably on this webcast because you've heard of it. I think in most cases, people have not only heard of it, but they are in a place where they're having to build out regulation, having to do risk assessments, having to think about how GDPR impacts their company. That said, we'll go through an overview for those that may not be aware, and that'll also set the stage for what we talk about. So GDPR, Regulation 2016-679, really, this is not, I wouldn't call it net new in some cases. Really, the PII, or consideration of private data, has been an element in regulation for quite some time. If you look at the EU 9546 EC was their original guidance, which came out in 1995. And that got into PII as we think of it or have traditionally thought of it, which is a relatively limited scope. I think beforehand we probably thought that was all the scope there was for PII. And then as soon as GDPR came out, we realized there could be different interpretations. The purpose of GDPR really was to standardize within the EU the rules in place. And the way I think of this oftentimes is if you look at the United States and how they dealt with national transportation rules. You know, there was a time where truckers, if they were driving between states, would have to take mud flaps off the back of their truck in one state and then pull over before they went into another state to put the mud flaps back on due to the rules of the road and the rules of driving. Well, obviously this creates an undue burden on truckers to have to continually pull over and have to modify their rig so that they can comply with whatever the local ordinance is. And so the rules were then standardized nationally to ensure that truckers could drive from New York to LA and not have an issue along the way. And really, when you think about GDPR, it's very similar, if not the same, in the purpose of its rollout. The purpose of this was to standardize at a broader level. 9546 EC was not as prescriptive, and the scope was more limited. And what that led to is different countries having different interpretations of the rules. And so if you looked back in the early days of PII in the United States, you would deal with France, who had modest regulation, versus Germany, who had heavy regulation. And I think at one point, Germany was the first to come out and say that if Google Maps had a picture of the street, you as a user or as a person had the ability to opt out of them showing your home. So if you went to Google Maps and you looked at a street in Germany and you spun your camera around, half those homes would be blurred out. In the United States, we would feel that to be an overreach of the regulation, but obviously to the German regulatory agency and the people of Germany, they felt that that was what constituted personal data. And so what you ended up with was a situation where each member state of the EU was interpreting these rules differently, or so to speak, we're adding on to them, because 9546 EC kind of set a baseline that said, hey, there's PII and needs to be protected, and then it was up to each member state to really define what that meant. And so the purpose of the GDPR regulation was to expand on that initial and replace that initial guidance, and to be more prescriptive and to have a broader scope of rules defining what personal data means and defining what you can do with personal data, defining the constituencies within personal data. And then there's also a lot of language around management of that from a legislation or a jurisdiction perspective of, you know, if an organization is based in France and has operations in Germany and Ireland and the UK, you know, where does the jurisdiction fall if there's an infraction? Who's the one who has to enforce it, right? So there was other things that were more governmental and operational in nature for them to clarify on. And the other purpose really was to continue what the EU started in 1995, which was to push for privacy and data and to define what they feel are the rights that are an obligation as a human being, right? If you're a living person, you have a right to your data being private. And so it's, as I think about it, it's very much people first, but business second. And that's not to accentuate the fact that business is coming after people, is to accentuate the fact that in the list of priorities, business is right there as a number 2. And they talk a lot about the regulation, if you read the original documents, about how it's meant to prohibit any sort of issues that might prohibit the flow of data, that might get in the way of organizations having to do business. Because again, if you think back to the trucker example, if you were a business in the EU that was processing data 5 years ago, you had to understand what each member state's regulation was. And so, you know, for companies that were very large in the US, like Google or Facebook or Twitter, all of a sudden as a processor, you had to be thinking about what the rules were in each place. And so I think in most cases, US companies were just defaulting to the lowest common denominator in some sense. So they would say, you know, if Germany is the most restrictive member state in the EU, then let's just make our entire privacy program comply with Germany, and that way we cover everything else. Again, the hard part there is then now you're allowing a single member state to define a broad-based rule set, which may or may not be the right way to think about it. And so again, the GDPR's focus on business here is to say, you know, we'll create a national rule set, or in this case, a member state rule set for the union that everyone can follow. Now, this doesn't supersede local laws. There may be local laws that are specific to each member state that you have to comply with. But again, there's more nuance to that now around what you have to follow and why you have to follow it. And there's a lot more clarity on what the rules and the jurisdictions and the enforcement are. Again, a very long document. Having read it, I will attest to the 88 pages, 11 chapters, 99 articles, 173 recitals. One thing that's very nice about their regulation, though, is it's in plain language. So if you're not familiar with it, I would recommend going to their website and downloading it. You know, reading through it is some of it feels a little bit like what we'd call legalese, where you're getting into kind of duplicative statements that are meant to kind of structure the scope of the document. But if you breeze through it, you read through the recitals and you look at some of the articles where they define stuff, it's pretty clear on what they mean. That said, they do follow the habit or precedent of most regulatory boards, including the SEC in the United States, where they will give a lot of guidance, but they refrain from making hard and fast statements. So they'll tell you what personal data is, but they won't tell you what it isn't. And the purpose of that, the same reason the PCAOB does that from a regulatory perspective in the United States, is that their goal is to kind of set the stage and to put the guide rails in place. But really it's going to be the practitioners and the day-to-day situations that are going to legislate the last mile of that regulation. So even though we look at GDPR as it is today and how it's going to be when the deadline of May 25th hits, you know, where's that regulation going to be May 25th, 2019? Who knows? I mean, I doubt there'll be a large setback. We're not going to go away from a lot of that regulation, but I think through practice and through review and audits and companies going through the process and feeling the pain and giving feedback, you're going to see this evolve like all regulation evolves. So who does this apply to? Any company that holds or processes personal data, EU citizens, and now including employee data. Under PII, yes, PII included employee data, but you know, now it gets into other spaces, which we'll talk about in a bit, that kind of increase the scope of what PII means. So data controllers, companies, and data processors, hosts, right? So both the technology and the people. It does not matter if the company has operations in the EU, right? Again, if you have, it's very much people focused. If you have data on EU citizens, then you're in scope. And then some exceptions apply. This is one of the areas I think that they were sober and level-headed in this regulation, where they say if for a compelling reason you need to have the data, or if really it would cause an undue burden on your company to have to get rid of it or not to collect it, then there's exceptions, right? And a good example here is if, let's say you're an intermediary for VAT and GST tax. Well, in that case, you need to have a certain set of data in order to be able to process those taxes, and then in order to be able to be audited later on if somebody comes back and wants to see that information. So it's an undue burden for an organization like that to have to not collect that data, right? And again, if you knew PII and you knew privacy and how we thought about it prior to GDPR, the whole basic premise of it was based on notification and consent, right? At the end of the day, if you notify somebody you're collecting this data and you get their consent, then in that case, you've put yourself within the compliance, even though you still own that data. That said, where the GDPR makes significant changes in this space is they're very prescriptive in that the language needs to be transparent, it needs to be clear and easily understandable. And in many cases, they reference children because they feel that children we have a greater responsibility to protect children's data and children in general, so that your language around notification needs to be easily consumable by a child, which any of you on here that's read any sort of data statement out of a piece of technology that you've downloaded or accepted terms on in the last year knows that that's currently not the case, right? So there'll probably be a significant amount of work in that notification space. And what's the cost of non-compliance? Up to 20 million euros or 4% of organizations' annual revenue, whichever is higher. And this is not a one-time fine, right? So it's not like you just pay it and you're done. And it also does not prevent individuals from filing claims related to their personal data being compromised, right? So really the big point that we're making here is that GDPR places a burden on companies to defend their actions. And so GDPR is not a one-time exercise, right? This is not a set it and forget it, right? Or as we say, report and forget, right? You don't come in and say, yep, I'm compliant, I'm good, I've got a stamp and we're good to go. It means that you need to have procedures and processes and policies in place that support constant monitoring, constant reassessment, constant risk assessment, and constant increased understanding of what the regulation is as it might change, and then what you're doing about it or how you're reacting to it. So let's start with some GDPR myths and misconceptions. I think this is always a good place to start. It covers some of the kind of fact or fiction of it, and some of this may be basic for those that have an understanding, and some of this may be new for. So GDPR doesn't apply to my company. We're based in the US, right? I think we covered that. It's not the case. If you process personal data from EU citizens, including employees, GDPR applies to you. I mean, if you're a 26-person company and one of your employees sits in France and you have employee data there, you're now in scope. GDPR is a marketing issue, right? I think it's often mythology that this has to do with marketing lists and do not contact and, you know, how much information do you collect about people? This is not the case, right? Again, personal data, and we'll get into the definition of personal data, really is more expanded than PII. And so it gets into other attributes and other factors. GDPR is an IT issue, right? I think obviously IT needs to be involved, but it's not strictly an IT issue, right? This is like any good regulatory effort. You need to involve all stakeholders. For those of you that were on my session on Monday when we talked about, you know, risk assessments and mitigating risks, it's the same concept. You need to have A, people that have the knowledge, B, people that have the power or the responsibility, and C, the more opinions you get, the better off you're going to be. So if you're talking to marketing and IT only, right, and you're not including HR, you're missing an opportunity. If you're including marketing, IT, and HR, and you're not including leadership, you're missing an opportunity, right? And so I think some of this is standard blocking and tackling when it comes to compliance and regulation. GDPR is all about the right to be forgotten. Again, there's many more privacy rights introduced, which we'll cover. It's not just the right to be forgotten, right? So again, it's if you make the mistake of thinking about GDPR as, well, it's just PII, right? I think you've already kind of underestimated the scope and the breadth. GDPR is PII, we know how to handle that. Definition of personal data under GDPR is rather broad and extends beyond traditional PII definitions. And one of the points that's made in multiple writings about GDPR is that their first statement is personal data is any information. And if you think about that, that's very specific, because what they're not saying is personal data is this type or that type, right? They start, if you think about this in a funnel of saying, what's the data I start with, and then how do I define from that data what personal data is? I mean, they're saying any information. And it seems kind of like a passive statement when you read it, but as you read about it and you read experts who talk about it and talk about kind of the legal standard that they're setting here, is they're really setting initially as any data, and then they go and they define it further, but it's not saying this is any user data, or this is any employee data, or this is any digital data, or this is any paper data, right? Again, they're being as broad as they can, and they're filtering it down, and they don't filter it aggressively. And then my risk of infraction is static, right? Meaning once I've done my risk assessment on day one, on May 25th, my risk assessment's done, and I say, you know what, we're good, we have a low risk, we're fine. That's not the case, because as you think about this concept of any information, what that means is the more data you collect, the more risk you have. And there's great examples you can find in articles written by various folks that talk about examples of this, right? So if you say, here's data of all my users on my system and what color their hair is, maybe that doesn't by itself constitute personal data. But as you start to collect more data, at some point you're going to have an aggregation of data that becomes what they would consider to be personally identifiable, and at that point now you're in scope. And so I think that the key point here is that this is a constant effort. You constantly need to be reassessing as you move your business, as you're a processor or a controller or whatever it is you're doing. You have to constantly be reassessing that risk against that baseline and understanding how your continued operations are potentially changing your risk level. You know, PII is focused on the ability to identify or single out a person, right? So we know that for PII. Personal data is defined initially as any information, which we talked about. So PII plus physical attributes, psychological attributes, genetic attributes, mental, economic, cultural, all of this is included in personal data. I mean, it even includes online identifiers, so cookie identifiers, RFID tags. A lot of this data wasn't initially scoped in for PII. In some cases, it came into scope as part of kind of that legislation and operation of privacy as an industry, you know, but it's being defined up front here as far as GDPR becomes. And once you combine that data, it all becomes personal, right? And another one that didn't used to be PII, but is now considered personal data, which I find interesting, is even data that's considered an opinion. So if you have an employee record and you store their quarterly performance review, even though that quarterly performance review may be a write-up by a manager, which is only an opinion of somebody's performance, that's considered personal data. And so then thus that kind of data falls under all the regulation and what the rights are that people have. So we'll talk about some key definitions. So data processors, right, think systems, think, in our case, Oracle. So if you have HCM set up, you know, you're collecting data about employees, you now have a data processor that has personal data, right? If you're a technology company and you have a front end of the website, you know, if you're collecting user information, login information, you know, alias, Twitter handle, and even if you're collecting like telemetry data about what are people doing when they're on your website, all of that's considered personal data. Data controllers, so think companies, so organizations, define what personal data is collected. And the interesting part here is that it's not just digital data, right? So, you know, even data that's been written down, whereas I think oftentimes with PII, we tended to default to thinking that this was a technology issue. Under GDPR regulation, it includes anything that's written down by hand. And so one thing I don't know the answer on, and I'm not sure it's been clearly defined, is statute of limitations and where that goes, because obviously if you think about legacy companies with a lot of paper records, right? If all of that becomes personal data, then the construct and the process you're going to have to put around that data is going to be significant. So privacy by design and by default, right? So again, GDPR is getting into defining what does this mean, right? And you know, how much of this is PII type data where we're being predictive about what it is, and how much of this is data that just becomes personal because of the way it's used. Right, the right to be forgotten, which we've talked about, anonymized data. It's interesting the way that they write up how you need to anonymize data, right? You're allowed to do that, right? So that's something that's been happening under PII for a lot of years, is this anonymization. That's something you're still able to do. And I think fortunately for a lot of organizations, GDPR is clear that the risk of anonymization of data and the ability for somebody to de-anonymize that data, that really that risk is predicated on how clearly obvious and relatively easy it would be to de-anonymize that data, right? So I think what this does is it kind of gets into almost the reasonable assurance concept of a lot of these frameworks, in saying that just because somebody at the organization is mathematically intelligent enough to go in and break an algorithm that's anonymizing data, that in itself doesn't mean there's a risk, because that means that the expertise to that person has to be extraordinary, or the efforts to go through have to be extraordinary. The cost of going and breaking that algorithm has to be extraordinary, right? So the point is it shouldn't be easily de-anonymized by the controller. And if the path to get there is too stringent, too outside the bounds of normal reality, then it doesn't have to be considered. And I think that's good because it puts a little bit of brakes on the regulation as a whole, to be clear that the risk is really predicated on normal, reasonable behavior by people. And then notification of breach. So if you have a breach, 72 hours. I think if you look at some of the past breaches in the United States, this is a significant delineation, whereas 72 hours is a lot shorter time than I think you normally see, right? And what that means is, from a process perspective, you need to have good kind of processes that trigger immediately and that are in place and ready to go, because you need to be able to have your hands around this issue by the time you have to notify, right? And I think that's a key thing for a lot of folks. Is I think in the past, when a breach has occurred, there's been kind of, let's circle around, let's look at our documentation, what our disaster plan is in this scenario, and let's follow that through. Oftentimes that can take a week or two just to get that part going, where now you need to be all the way to the point of notification in 72 hours. So let's talk about the rights that are inherent in this, right? So a right to access, right? So any data that qualifies as personal data, EU citizens have to be able to have access to it, right? So this gets into all of the telemetry data collected by supermarkets with what you shop for, data collected by your telephone company on where you go, right? They need to be able to have access to all that data and to see what all that data is, which is a significant requirement. A right to amend, right? So, EU data subjects need to not only be able to see the data, but if they feel that that data is incorrect, they have the right to suggest an amendment, right? And the point of this is to make sure that companies have data that is truthful in the representation of of that person and that data subject. And so this creates an interesting problem, because now you have to have the ability to edit that data. You have to know, you have to know where it is. You have to have the ability to edit it, right? So you can't have immutable data logs. From a technology perspective, this changes the way you can handle data or where you handle data. Right to be forgotten, which I think we're all familiar with, right? Right of data portability. Again, that's a piece of PII that we're familiar with. The right to be informed, right? So this gets into the information and consent piece, and again, I stress the requirement around clear language that's understandable by everyone is a very interesting concept. When they teach in colleges and master's programs about being on television and being a TV reporter, they always say that you need to speak at the level of a 7th grader, because that seems to be the most consumable age or consumable technicality of language. I find it interesting that GDPR is going beyond that and saying that a child needs to understand it, right? So when you think about all those T's and C's that we look at and sign off and check a box on, they have to be dead clear. A right to restrict processing, right? So people have to be able to opt out, right? And so from a UI design and engineering technology perspective, for a lot of internet companies, this is significant. And also depending on your business model, right? If you're in a business model where you're a freemium service, where your product is free for access, but you make your money on the selling of data, the ability for people to opt out of that has a significant impact on a lot of organizations, right? It could be a significant impact to your revenue. A right to object, right? So, it gets into the ability to have a conversation about my data and what I want to do with my data. And then again, a right to have data rectified, right? So the right to amend and the right to have data rectified. And then the rights related to automated processing of data, right? So again, this is just being extremely specific on, yes, this has to do with IT, yes, this has to do with technology, yes, this has to do with manual processes, and it also has to do with things that people say, well, we don't know what we do there because we have an algorithm that runs this, right? So I have rights to know what that is. I have rights to understand the algorithm that's anonymizing my data. A lot of this becomes a legal issue, but also an operational issue, right? I think this last point is valid, which is, always assume that you're going to be audited. think this, for those of you that are in compliance or regulation, this is an obvious statement. But the point is you don't want to ever be in a position where you're audited and you're not ready for it, right? So a lot of this becomes being proactive, doing the risk assessments, making sure you have your hands around it, and then making sure you have a good response when you need it. So with that, I am going to hand over to Keith, and Keith's going to talk about planning for GDPR.
Awesome, good job, Aiden. Thanks for setting it up. That's a great overview of the GDPR regulations, and I think where Aiden ended just now, to assume that you're always going to be audited if you're a constituent. And if these regulations are incumbent upon your organization, is a great reason to start planning for GDPR. From our research, from our interaction with our customers and our partners, most of the organizations in the United States, even though this is coming in May this year, are still in the planning phases for GDPR. Many companies have assessed whether this applies to them, but in doing so, they haven't really gotten far beyond the assessment stage. So in planning for GDPR, there are typically 4 critical high-level steps that you can see laid out here. And this is going to represent your starting point for preparation. Obviously, this is not going to get you to the point where you're ready to be audited by the European Union and not have these heavy fines levied upon you. Aiden already mentioned that the regulation applies to many companies beyond the borders of the European Union, but I think it's really important to reiterate that if you're doing business that impacts EU citizens in any way, you're likely to be required to be compliant. So that covers a broad swath of organizations, including much of the United States organizations. It's really a global market these days, and most companies that are selling some kind of service or some kind of product are doing so, maintaining European citizens' data. So it's also important to note, as I just said, that the cost of non-compliance is a very hefty fine, and it is going to be levied without fail. We expect that there may potentially be some warnings at the outset, but by no guarantee is that incumbent upon the regulators here. They might just come out swinging and apply fines right at the outset. So the steps outlined above in identifying the personal data that your organization maintains, assessing your compliance status, addressing any noted gaps, and then maintaining those activities are going to require significant documentation to demonstrate compliance. And this is going to be a theme throughout my slides, is document, 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 because the more that you can prove, the less that the EU is going to want to come back and audit you a second and a third time. So while many of us are used to the level of documentation to support internal controls for audit processes, whether that be for Sarbanes-Oxley or other kinds of regulations, GDPR is not assessed at a point in time like some of those regulations. GDPR requires that their constituents maintain this level of scrutiny throughout the period, thereby having more of a continuous monitoring process over the internal controls rather than a point in time. You know, SOX may require this to decrease the substantive work as of a certain date, usually on the date of the financial statements on 12/31 potentially. And the internal controls opinion is definitely on the day of the audit. But GDPR is going to require that these be a continuous process, be a continuous process that you can prove are operating not only at that point in time throughout the year. So in doing so, you're more reliant upon those automated processes with continuous monitoring. If you're relying upon detective internal controls, such as reports and reviews of transactions, you're probably going to have to up the frequency at the very least. But in my personal opinion, you probably want to try and transform that environment a little bit into where you're relying more on that automated continuous process. Aiden, could we move forward to the next slide in identifying personal data? So obviously, step one in this process is going to be identifying the personal data that your company stores, and not only what personal data that you're maintaining and what personal data that you're storing, how it flows into and out of your critical business systems. In today's world, we no longer rely typically upon one on-premise system. 10 years ago, there may have been a lot of large companies who were operating on Oracle EBS, and it was Oracle EBS on-premise for every piece of their systems. Today's environment is typically more with some cloud systems. You might have multiple ERPs where you're operating in the hub and spoke model. You might have a separate CRM, a separate HCM, and there's so many more systems that are considered critical business systems. But it's not just in scope for audit. This is any system that's maintaining PII or personal information of EU citizens in general. So it's important to establish which systems this personal data resides in and how it's classified. When we get into the compliance related to this data, it's going to be critical because an organization's responsibilities vary based upon the type of data that is collected. So for example, if your data collected directly from your customers, is your data collected directly from your customers or is it collected automatically? Do you have consent to do so? Is it computed data or is it manual data? All of these factors are going to dictate a company's obligations in this area. Every one of these types of data is going to have a different requirement upon how you're maintaining it, what the ability is to port that data and to purge that data, and what the regulations say about access to that data. So to summarize, identify all potentially personal data, the inflows and the outflows of this data, which systems are impacted, and finally, make certain to classify it based upon GDPR's rules. Actually, can we back up one, Aiden? Thanks. So GDPR establishes many requirements for your organization, some of which were discussed previously, such as the classification of your data, but some of these are going to require that your company establish processes that may not already be in place at this point in time. For instance, the right to be forgotten process and the data portability requirement. These create a need for companies to establish a process that, when requested by EU citizens, would allow for their customers' personal data to be completely purged or potentially disseminated to them. So we have to have a process established in order to do so. In addition, it is incumbent for impacted organizations to establish the role of a data steward. A data steward, which they label as a data protection officer or a DPO, is responsible for maintaining these processes. So whatever processes are required in order to take that data and port it out in the way that GDPR requires for their citizens, which includes to other organizations, which includes purging that data and proving to the citizen themselves that you've purged that data, is incumbent upon this data protection officer to establish and maintain and test. So that takes us into addressing any current gaps in your process. So now that we've assessed our current state, we'll address the gaps. This is something that we're used to doing in the United States here, right? Essentially, let's mitigate any risk that is perpetuated here, focusing upon our customers' privacy and rights as it applies to their data. We're comfortable with that. The governance process of establishing centralized governing documents like policies and practices that are established across an organization is something that most U.S. companies, and definitely all publicly traded U.S. companies at this point, already probably have in place. That said, this will require the establishment of policies and practices that might not be terribly common in U.S. organizations today, like a data governance policy. If there is already a data governance policy in place and already established, it's usually thought to be owned and managed and not even disseminated far beyond the IT department. Whereas now, under GDPR, it's going to be incumbent upon these organizations to ensure that all roles who touch the personal data of customers, including potentially sales and marketing, HR, legal, finance, field services, and many more, are not only aware of it, but also trained and considered themselves to be data stewards. So what this requires is to go far beyond what the current requirements of getting a policy established and getting the IT department who owns the data to be able to consider themselves data stewards. This is really motivating the entire organization to consider themselves data stewards, because everybody who touches this and everybody who has access to it in their critical business systems is going to be a critical party as it applies to data governance. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is in order to establish an ongoing process and more of an organizational culture rather than a one-time control. Now, in maintaining compliance activities, in order to govern an entire ecosystem of data, centralization is not only recommended, it's probably going to be required. Maintaining these compliance activities across an organization where systems and data are out in the field without any centralization is going to be virtually impossible to prove in the governing body, prove to the governing body when they come and audit your organization. More than just training people from a central place and more than establishing the policies and practices, this is a requirement of getting ownership of this in a central organization, which is why it's going to be incumbent upon that DPO, the data protection officer that that GDPR helps to requires you to establish, to monitor these activities and make sure that across the organization we're considering them to be requirements. And as it applies to internal controls and your processes, performing them detectively and at a regular interval, it might be sufficient for the SEC here in the United States, but it's not going to be for the European Union. These requirements for the European Union must be current, they must be maintained and tested to ensure that they are available to their citizens. So what this is going to require is documentation, and more documentation in order to prove that to not only the EU citizens but their governing body when they come and audit you, to avoid those heavy fines. Again, it's not it's the EU citizens who have required this. So if it appears to be too much regulation and too much government intervention, that's not really the case here. That's a little bit of an American perspective on GDPR. This is actually the European citizens who are saying to organizations, who are saying to businesses, not only in the United States, but also in their home countries, that in order to do business here, you must be able to comply with these regulations, because we consider it a right to be able to protect our data. Our citizens' data is a requirement. Yep.
You're getting a little interference on your microphone.
Can you hear me better now?
There you go. You knew it was coming, so you prepped me for it.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, sounds good.
Oh, sorry about that. Now you can hear me better, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Fantastic. Sorry about that.
Very
So
good.
just to back up real quickly, this is EU citizens who have established this regulation. To say that it appears to be too much regulation, too much government intervention, it's not typically the case here. That's actually a little bit of an American attitude towards GDPR. And to think that this is potentially going away, or that there will be a waiver or an extension to it, such as there are with a lot of FASB regulations that are issued, that does not appear to be happening here. This is happening, and it's the European citizens who are saying to organizations not only in the United States who collect EU citizen data, but even within their home states and within their home countries, that in order to do business here, you must be able to comply with these regulations, because we consider it a right of our human. We consider it a human right that we be able to purge this data and we be able to maintain our personal data as personal. I have a whole new perspective on this, just becoming a father for the first time 3 weeks ago. Though in telling all of you that, I should probably delete that because it's probably PII. So we'll burn this recording after this. But what are some of the unknowns when it comes to GDPR? So I think we already covered a lot of this, and Aiden, you can skip to the next slide. I think we already covered a lot of this, but there are still a lot of unknowns, such as how will companies be chosen for audit? There are a ton of companies doing business in the EU, and how are we going to know that? How are we going to know that the EU, how they find out about companies that are doing business with EU citizens? Will it be call and response? Will it be an EU citizen alerting them to the fact that they think their personal data is being compromised and that this company is not in compliance with GDPR? You know, I'm positive that the EU has a list of all companies doing business within their own city-states, but who's to say that they do within the United States, within Mumbai, India, within Singapore? How are they going to find out about these, and who gets audited? You know, do I think a company like Oracle potentially could be high up on the list because they have a lot of data? Certainly. When I worked for Oracle, this was a big concern. And we heard it and talked about it a lot, that it was coming. So further, what exactly represents personal data? You know, Aiden got into a lot of this at the outset, and I'm not going to review every piece of it, but until these audits are conducted, we don't really know exactly what will be considered personal data, what exactly will be will be required to be purged. You know, I love. I think that most important here is that we be able to classify our data, and we be able to say exactly what it represents, where it's stored, and what the process would be in order to purge it, whether that be personal data or not. That way, you're not getting yourself into trouble of taking a position on a gray piece of data that you don't have to have a process there. You know, another unknown is, will fines be levied immediately, or will there be some kind of warning period that's granted? We just don't know. And then finally, beyond there, there's a great deal of this regulation that's kind of open for interpretation at this point. Aiden mentioned, if you read the whole thing, you're probably going to go to sleep for a year every night on a very comfortable pillow, and it can be established by individual countries within and outside the EU. So each individual country is kind of taking their own perspective towards it right now. That said, the governing body who is conducting the audits will hopefully take more of a standardized approach towards their audits and what they're considering personal data. And then finally, in summation, if we want to go to the summary slide, GDPR is almost here and it's not being extended. With the deadline's not changing, we are going to need to be compliant this year on May 25th, or at least prove that we're moving in the right direction. So these planning activities that I was just talking about, it's really critical that we start establishing that right away. The traditional controls that we know and love, and I say that a little tongue-in-cheek because nobody loves internal controls except for myself, that we know and love here in the United States definitely play a role. But from my personal perspective, we're talking about ongoing, continuous controls. But if you're going to rely upon detective controls, which are back-end and reporting, you most likely will have to at least up the frequency in order to create a process. That's the word that we're looking for. This has to be a process to be able to comply with the GDPR regulations. And then finally, as we now know, GDPR doesn't care about geographic location. And I think that's an important point for everybody on this call to take away. It's all about whether you maintain EU citizens' data or not. And there's not many companies in today's world that don't sell into a global market. So Aiden, at this point, let me hand this back over to you. Do you have any final thoughts that you might want to add and leave people to consider in preparing for GDPR?
No, I think you covered the summary. I mean, again, I think in a short but sweet version, the regulations in place, you can go out, you can read it. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of knowledge out there around the rules and the regulation and what the definitions are. But that said, be ready to change, be ready to watch the regulation as it grows and it's molded by practitioners and by infractions. I think it's going to be a constantly shifting landscape. And I think one of the points you made there, Keith, about the fact that you're going to see non-EU companies adopting this, I think, as we all sell into this global marketplace, we all need to be aware of what the tightest constraint is within that business model. And so I think you'll end up seeing a lot of organizations adopt this just because why not? So with that, I think, Tiffany, do we have any questions? And if you guys don't have questions now and you want to email Keith or I, this is our email address. But for now, did we have any that came in via chat, Tiffany?
We currently don't have any questions, but I want to say thank you for your presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box. And just while we're waiting on questions, I would like to once again say thank you to both Keith and Aiden for closing out our Risk Week sessions. We have, as I mentioned earlier in the call, other opportunities to extend this conversation. As I mentioned, OAUG will host over 500 sessions at Collaborate, similar to this session on April 22nd through 26th at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so again, we want to know, where do we go next? We want you to tell our SIG, our special interest groups, our Oracle application users, what knowledge, support do you need? And of course, our thought leaders, what other visions are essential? Aiden and Keith, we do not have any questions. But again, as Aiden mentioned, if you have any questions after this webinar has ended, please reach out to Aiden or Keith via their emails to answer your questions or ask your questions. It concludes another great e-learning session, which is a OAUG member benefit. Thank you guys for making Risk Week a success. Everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thanks, everybody, for your time.
Thanks all.